General Motors' controversial decision to force the closing of hundreds of dealerships is triggering a backlash from store owners who are now contemplating legal action. At the same time, consumers express outrage about losing service.
The former auto behemoth sent letters to some 250 affected dealerships across the country a couple of weeks ago, notifying them that they would be closing by October 2010. The move came as GM was in the midst of negotiating billions of dollars in loans from the federal and provincial levels of government and had to show Washington, Ottawa, and Queen's Park that they were prepared to turn the company on their head. But is closing stores rather than letting the market decide who stays open really the answer?
The man rallying his fellow GM dealers is Bob Slessor, president of Robert Slessor Pontiac Buick GMC in Grimsby. He joins us in studio. Well, Professor Steve Howse of the Degroote School of Business is in our newsroom. And Bob, we'll begin with you. You're a Pontiac dealer. You had to know that you were in jeopardy when it was revealed that that division was doomed.
Well, we anticipated some reduction in rationalization of the dealer body, of course.
Well, yeah, that's one thing. I mean, but realistically, it means that probably your business wasn't going to be there. Is that not true?
Well, we didn't anticipate that. No, that was something that caught us blindsided. We anticipated going forward with the Buick and the GMC divisions, and we were prepared to do that and represent General Motors as we always have for 54 years.
Steve, do you think that GM is over-dealered or was over-dealered?
Well, to start off, I was a big proponent that we should have been focusing far less on the few factory workers and more on the hundreds and hundreds of jobs that would be jeopardized on this issue. That being said, this is one of the big Achilles heel of the system right now, is they have far too many dealers. And it's not a question of letting the market decide. That would work if you need to reduce it by 10% or 20%, but we're looking at cutting the number of dealers in half, and unfortunately that has to be done with a surgical stroke.
Bob, legally, is GM in default of their franchise agreement by shutting you and other dealers down?
Well, that's in dispute at the present time. We're looking at that option with our lawyers, but I would say we should be careful with breach of contract.
Bob, if your dealership really is closed down and anybody that wants to purchase a GM vehicle then has to go where?
Well, our closest dealer would be Hamilton Mountain, City of St. Catharines, about a 30 to 35-minute drive for my particular customers to receive service on their General Motors vehicle.
And isn't that the key to your industry? It's the service, and most people I know want convenience when it comes to servicing a vehicle.
Our industry is all about customer service. I think we have to remember it's the customer that drives the sale. It's the customer that returns to the dealership for service. And if we can't provide that, we're dead in the water.
Steve, wouldn't you agree that if you own a vehicle, you want to be able to find somebody close by who can service that vehicle? If you have to drive 35 minutes, you're not going to buy that vehicle.
Well, let's be realistic. It's not 35 minutes to go from one part of Hamilton to another. It depends on where people live.
But if you go to Grimsby,
bigger issue is the smaller communities that we're talking about, where they're talking about maybe having to drive 2 hours, 3 hours. That's the real issue that GM is trying to avoid. So they're going to go to the most populated areas, and that's where they're going to have to cut the hardest to get the numbers down. The other side of the coin is there enough demand in this marketplace to sustain that many dealerships? And GM feels there isn't. I'm not a proponent that picking this one over this one. There's been a lot of imbalance and inequities on how this whole process has been done, but what actually has to be done is far less dealerships.
Let's talk about compensation. Bob, what happens to people who are losing their companies?
Well, basically, we were offered 2 months' expenses to wind up our operations and be gone by December 31st of '09. And woefully inadequate when you're talking about a company that's shared a business relationship with General Motors for 54 years.
But I mean, you've got to be losing a lot of money.
Well, there's major costs involved. They had us do a $3.5 million renovation. We've only been into that 5 years. Of course, you can understand we haven't had an opportunity to pay those debts down. With the loss of a franchise, I don't know how I'm going to pay those debts down.
And you're stuck with, initially, you're stuck with, I guess, all of the expenses that go with that.
There are expenses. As independent dealers, General Motors does not assist us in facilities or land acquisition. They just mandate the specifications of which we must build to.
Steve, does it reasonable to expect that people like Bob can go to other car companies and basically represent them and still make a good living?
Well, we've certainly seen a lot of locations transition from one brand to the other over the years. And there are a significant number of dealers out there who are not just one brand. In the early days of this business, if you were a GM dealer, that's all you were allowed to deal. But now there's a lot of business people out there who are not only a GM dealer, but they have a BMW franchise or they have a Toyota franchise. They have other business interests, which allowed them to diversify and put themselves in a position to manage this type of situation. Not taking anything away from the challenge of this situation, but let's be clear, this company is in receivership and they're eliminating brands and drastically cutting the entire organization.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the very beginning of this interview that you thought that this was really going to cause a lot of jobs. I mean, how many jobs are we talking about at the end of this procedure?
Well, Bob's the expert in this area, but the numbers I've heard is an average dealership will employ about 100 people. So you do the math of how many dealerships they're looking at shutting down, it dramatically overshadows the issue of the factory worker that got so much media attention and so much attention from the government.
Is that true, Bob?
That's exactly true. I think the numbers might be a little high per average dealer, but a dramatic increase in the number of jobs lost throughout the country.
How many at your dealership alone, Bob?
We're down to 45 people. We were at 65, but our particular dealership is operating with 45 people.
And that
today.
means they will all be out of work.
Well, they'll all have to seek other employment opportunities if we're unable to rebrand and move forward in the automobile business.
We only have a few seconds left here, but Bob, I wanted to get something from you. If in fact you go ahead and you do launch a lawsuit on behalf of yourself and other dealers, aren't you in effect suing the taxpayer? Because we own the company now.
Well, I guess from that perspective, you may be accurate. However, General Motors also chose to make wind-down payments to the dealers, and I would ask the taxpayers, how do you feel about spending hard-earned taxpayer dollars on having dealers go away and take their 30 pieces of silver?
Okay, Bob Slessor is with Slessor Pontiac Buick GMC. Steve Howse with the Degroote School of Business. Thank you both.
My pleasure.
You.